Every man alive right now is being lied to by his own body every single day, and almost nobody has ever explained to him how the lie actually works. You feel desire, and you think it's yours. Your choice, your attraction, something private that belongs to you. It's not. And Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who spent his entire life staring directly at this problem without flinching, called it the greatest deception in human experience. Reproduction, he wrote, is the ultimate purpose of every organism, and its strongest instinct. Romantic love, however elevated it feels from the inside, however much it feels like the most profound and personal experience of your life, isn't actually about you at all. It's a biological trick, played by something Schopenhauer called the will, an impersonal blind force that runs through every living thing on Earth and uses the illusion of personal choice to get itself perpetuated through you. You think you're choosing, when really you're just being used by something much older than you. He wrote that after you succumb to sexual desire, you realize you've once again been deceived by the instinct of survival that seeks procreation through you. The same trick, every time, and every time it feels completely new and completely yours. Schopenhauer remained celibate his entire life, and not out of weakness. It was the conclusion that seeing the trick clearly was the only way to stop being fully controlled by it. I want to talk today about lust properly, because almost everything said about it publicly is either useless moral panic or useless permissive nonsense, and neither version actually helps a man understand what's happening inside him or what it's doing to the world around him right now, in 2026, at a scale that's genuinely civilizational. Start with the basic mechanism, because understanding it is the foundation for everything else in this video. Lust convinces your brain that short-term pleasure is more valuable than long-term meaning. That's the whole trick, reduced to a single sentence, and every other consequence flows from that one substitution. The neurological pathway involved, the mesolimbic dopamine system, doesn't distinguish particularly well between a genuine, hard-won accomplishment and an easily accessed synthetic stimulus. It responds to both, but it responds to them differently over time. Genuine accomplishment builds a tolerance that still leaves room for deeper satisfaction. Synthetic stimulus, repeated and escalated, builds a tolerance that requires more and more input for the same diminishing return, which is exactly the same mechanism that governs every other addiction humans are capable of forming. This isn't new to the 21st century either, and I want to be clear about that immediately, because one of the biggest mistakes people make when they talk about this is treating it as a purely modern problem created purely by modern technology. What's actually modern is the scale, the accessibility, and the complete removal of every natural friction that used to exist between a man and the object of his desire. St. Augustine of Hippo wrote about this exact struggle 1600 years ago with a level of honesty that almost nobody in the modern conversation matches. In his Confessions, written around 397 AD, he describes years of what he calls captivity to lust before his eventual conversion, and he includes one of the most quoted and most honest lines ever written about the specific psychological trap of wanting to change while not quite wanting to change yet. "Grant me chastity and continence," he wrote, "but not yet." That single sentence describes something almost every man watching this video has felt at some point, without ever having the words for it. The genuine desire to be free of something sitting right next to the genuine desire to keep it a little longer. Augustine wasn't weak. He became one of the most influential thinkers in the history of Western civilization. He was simply honest, in a way that modern discourse on this topic almost never manages to be, about the fact that the trap isn't stupidity or a lack of discipline, in any simple sense. It's a structural feature of being a conscious human being with a body that predates your conscious mind by hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary programming. Now, something more uncomfortable, because I think it belongs in this conversation and it's almost never included. As a young man in Vienna, before any of the history that made him infamous, Adolf Hitler told his close friend August Kubizek that he believed in complete sexual abstinence, and he described the reason as a need to protect what he called the flame of life. Whatever you think about the man, and there's nothing complicated about what history has judged him to be, that belief that sexual energy, suppressed and redirected, becomes a kind of fuel for something else entirely, isn't something he invented. It's a genuinely old idea across multiple traditions and multiple cultures, the notion that unspent desire, deliberately redirected rather than simply indulged or simply repressed, converts into an almost unnatural intensity of focus and drive. Whatever else is true about him, the obsessive, singular focus he brought to his political project for over 2 decades is a documented historical fact, and the connection he personally drew between sexual restraint and that intensity is also documented, in his own words, to someone who knew him before any of it began. I'm not telling you that story to hold him up as any kind of example to follow. I'm telling you because it demonstrates in the most extreme and darkest way history has to offer that the redirection of this energy is real, that it's powerful, and that it's genuinely dangerously agnostic about what it gets pointed toward. The same mechanism that can build a cathedral, write a symphony, or found an empire is the same mechanism that, pointed in the wrong direction by the wrong man, helped fuel one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. The energy itself carries no morality. What it gets aimed at is the only thing that decides whether it becomes something extraordinary or something monstrous. And I'll bring this into the present, because the actual data on what's currently happening to men is worse than most people realise, and almost nobody's connecting it to the mechanism Schopenhauer and Augustine were both independently describing centuries apart. More than 1 in 3 single Gen Z adults now identify as celibate, according to a joint study from the Kinsey Institute, with roughly 1 in 5 describing that celibacy as involuntary rather than chosen. 48% of Gen Z adults report never having had sex at all, more than double the rate reported by millennials at the identical age. The University of Chicago's General Social Survey found that 3 in 10 Gen Z men between 18 and 25 hadn't had sex in over a year. More than 60% of men under 30 currently report being single, and barely half of those single men say they're even actively looking for a relationship, a number that's fallen sharply in just a few years. At the exact same time that actual human intimacy has been collapsing across an entire generation, pornography consumption has done the opposite. Nearly 85% of teenagers aged 14 to 18 report having consumed pornography. 49% of men say they specifically struggle to reduce or control how much they watch. Average weekly social time spent physically with other human beings, fell from 12.8 hours in 2010 to 6.5 hours by 2019, a collapse that happened almost entirely within the smartphone era, before the pandemic ever entered the picture. Put those 2 facts next to each other, and the mechanism Schopenhauer described 2 centuries ago stops being metaphor and becomes something you can actually measure. An entire generation of men is being offered constant, escalating, infinitely available synthetic satisfaction of the exact drive that's supposed to push them toward genuine human connection, and the synthetic version is winning at scale in a way that's actively reducing the real thing rather than simply supplementing it. This isn't simply a story about willpower either. Your reward system doesn't know the difference in the moment between a real relationship built over months of vulnerability and effort and a video that delivers a comparable neurochemical spike in under 10 minutes with 0 risk, 0 rejection, and 0 actual connection required. Faced with that choice, repeated daily for years, at the exact age when a man's habits and expectations around intimacy are still being formed, the brain does exactly what brains do. It takes the path that costs less and pays out faster, and it keeps taking that path until the actual capacity for the harder, slower, more valuable version has visibly atrophied. This has a name now in the clinical literature: psychogenic erectile dysfunction. Dysfunction with no physical cause has risen sharply among men under 40, specifically in the decade since pornography became fully mobile and fully free. The mechanism is precisely what you predict from Schopenhauer's model of desire as a system that adapts to whatever stimulus it's fed. A brain trained for years on an escalating stream of novel, hyper-stimulating content becomes, quite literally, less responsive to the comparatively static, comparatively slow reality of an actual human partner. The trick Schopenhauer described, the will using pleasure to manipulate you into serving reproduction, has been short-circuited by a technology that offers the pleasure, while permanently disabling the reproduction it was designed to produce. Now let me talk about the weaponization of this, because lust has never simply been a private struggle. Throughout history, it's repeatedly been understood by people in positions of power as something that can be deliberately deployed against an enemy population. In April 2002, during the Israeli military occupation of Ramallah, 3 local Palestinian television stations were seized by Israeli soldiers. According to contemporary AFP and Reuters reporting from the time, hardcore pornographic content began broadcasting on those stations shortly afterward, at a moment when a 24-hour curfew meant Palestinian families, including children, were confined to their homes with nowhere else to go. The Israeli military officially denied responsibility and blamed Palestinian leadership instead, and to this day nobody's ever been conclusively proven responsible for the broadcast. What isn't in dispute is that it happened on stations under military occupation at exactly the moment it would cause maximum psychological disruption to a captive population. Whether it was a deliberate act of psychological warfare or, as some have argued, a careless mistake by an unnamed technician, the incident itself demonstrates something military and intelligence institutions have understood for a very long time. A population's sexual instincts aren't simply a private matter, they're a lever, and in the right or wrong hands that lever can be pulled deliberately. This isn't a new insight born of the internet age either. Governments and religious institutions throughout history have understood that a population's relationship to its own desire is one of the most effective points of control available. Control what a population is allowed to want, or flood it with more of what it wants than it can process, and you gain a specific kind of influence over its behaviour that direct force struggles to achieve nearly as efficiently. Which brings us to the actual civilizational scale of what's happening right now, because this isn't simply about individual men struggling privately, it's happening simultaneously, across an entire generation, in every Western country at once, and the aggregate effect is measurable in the same demographic data this channel has covered before. A generation of men whose capacity for stimulation has been trained by content rather than by connection is a generation that's measurably less able to form the relationships that produce marriage, family, and children. The birth rate collapse across the entire Western world, already documented extensively in previous videos on this channel, isn't a separate story from the one being told here. It's the same story, viewed from a different angle. You can't have a synthetic, infinitely available substitute for intimacy consuming the exact developmental years when men are supposed to be learning how to pursue, build, and maintain the real thing, and expect the actual formation of families to continue at anything like its previous rate. The demographic data and the pornography consumption data aren't two unrelated trends that happen to be occurring at the same time. They're cause and consequence, and very few people in mainstream discourse are willing to say that plainly. So what do you actually do with all of this? Because I'm not interested in leaving this as pure diagnosis with no direction forward. The advice given in most discussions of this topic centers entirely on willpower, and willpower on its own doesn't work, for a specific and well-documented reason. It's a finite resource that depletes with use across a day, and lust specifically isn't a problem that responds well to direct confrontation. Augustine understood this 16 centuries ago, even though he didn't have the neuroscience to explain why. The advice that's survived across nearly every serious tradition that's grappled with this problem, religious and secular alike, isn't resist, it's flee. Remove yourself physically and structurally from the conditions that produce the temptation rather than relying on repeatedly, exhaustingly saying no to something placed directly in front of you. Picture it as a boulder sitting at the top of a hill. In the earliest moments, a small push is still stoppable, you still have leverage. But the further it rolls, the steeper the slope becomes, and past a certain point there's no version of pure willpower capable of stopping what's now simply obeying gravity. The whole strategic objective is to intervene at the very top of that hill, before the boulder has any momentum at all, which in practice means controlling your environment, your access, and your daily habits, rather than trying to win a fight further down the slope, where the physics have already turned against you. The second part of the actual solution, and this is the part almost nobody explains properly, is that an empty life creates a vacuum that desire will always rush in to fill. Your brain organizes itself entirely around whatever it currently identifies as the dominant priority in your life at any given moment. If that priority is comfort, or boredom relief, or the easiest available source of stimulation, desire will occupy that space completely, because nothing else is competing for it. But the moment you have something genuinely demanding your full attention, a specific goal you're actively building toward, with real progress, you can actually track and see. The brain's priority structure shifts, and what used to feel like an overwhelming constant pull starts to feel, comparatively, like a minor and manageable distraction, rather than the main event of your day. That's not a claim invented for a self-help video either. It maps directly onto Schopenhauer's own framework, whether he intended it that way or not. If the will is going to use pleasure to direct your energy somewhere regardless of what you consciously want, the only real leverage you have is choosing, deliberately and in advance, what that energy gets aimed at before it defaults to the path of least resistance. Undirected, it flows towards the easiest available stimulus. Directed towards something that actually requires and rewards sustained effort, it becomes the same underlying force that built cathedrals, that drove entire lives of genuine achievement, just redirected rather than simply suppressed. There's something else worth saying honestly here, because it matters for how you actually see other people, not just how you manage your own habits. Constant exposure to synthetic, hyper-selected images and content trains a specific kind of comparison that has nothing to do with reality. A generation raised on content engineered by algorithms to select for the most extreme, most statistically rare examples of physical appearance develops expectations that no real relationship with any real person can consistently satisfy. That's not a small side effect, it directly degrades your capacity for genuine connection with the actual imperfect human beings who exist in your actual life, because you're unconsciously measuring them against a standard manufactured by an algorithm with zero interest in your long-term happiness and every interest in your continued engagement. I think about my own grandparents' generation a lot when this topic comes up, because the contrast is genuinely instructive rather than just nostalgic. They didn't have infinite choice constantly available. They largely met one person, built something with that person, and stayed, not purely because the option to look elsewhere didn't exist in the abstract, but because the actual friction and cost of pursuing an alternative was high enough that building what they already had made more practical sense than constantly searching for something theoretically better. That friction, which felt like a limitation to them in some ways, also appears to have produced a depth and durability of relationship that current data on marital satisfaction and commitment increasingly struggles to match. The removal of every barrier between desire and its immediate synthetic satisfaction hasn't made anyone freer in any way the actual data can measure. If anything, it's made an entire generation more isolated, more comparison-obsessed, and measurably less capable of doing the hard, sustained work that real intimacy has always required. Schopenhauer concluded that the only real freedom from the deception he identified was seeing it clearly enough to stop being fully controlled by it. He didn't believe the drive itself could simply be eliminated, and neither do I. It's not going anywhere. It's one of the most fundamental forces operating inside every man watching this video, exactly as it was operating inside Augustine 1600 years ago, and exactly as it was in its darkest possible redirection, operating inside the young man in Vienna who chose to point that same force somewhere history has never forgiven him for. The question was never whether the force exists inside you, because it obviously does, and pretending otherwise is exactly the kind of naive denial that leaves men completely unprepared for how powerful it actually is once they encounter it directly. The actual question, the one that decides almost everything else about the shape your life eventually takes, is what you choose to point it at, deliberately, before you find that something else, an algorithm, an industry, or simply the path of least resistance, has quietly made that choice for you. Schopenhauer and Augustine aren't the only two men in history who wrestled with this at the highest possible stakes, and it's worth widening the lens further because the pattern of how different men across history actually handled it is more instructive than either of their individual accounts on its own. Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest novelists who ever lived, wrote with brutal honesty in his own diaries about decades of struggle with exactly this, describing periods of what he called moral collapse followed by periods of intense discipline and productivity, a cycle that repeated across most of his adult life. He eventually channeled the same intensity that had once gone into that struggle into a late-life religious and moral philosophy so demanding it alienated much of his own family. Decades of internal war followed by an eventual, almost violent, redirection of that same energy into something else entirely, mirroring Augustine's arc from centuries earlier almost exactly, despite the two men having nothing else in common. Mahatma Gandhi wrote about his own struggles with lust in his autobiography, with a level of self-scrutiny that surprised even his own followers, describing a specific period as a young married man where he became consumed by sexual desire even while his father lay dying in the next room, an episode he later described as one of the deepest sources of shame in his entire life. He eventually took a formal vow of celibacy in his mid-30s, a decision he directly connected to his capacity for the sustained political discipline that would later define his entire public life. Whatever your view of him as a historical figure, that specific claim that redirecting that energy was a precondition for the discipline his later work required is one he made repeatedly and deliberately, not something imposed on him by later biographers. Napoleon Bonaparte took the opposite approach entirely, and he's worth including because he complicates any simple narrative that total abstinence is the only path to extraordinary achievement. His letters to Josephine and his various relationships afterwards show a man who never attempted suppression in anything like the Augustinian sense, and who nonetheless built one of the most consequential military and political careers in European history. What Napoleon does demonstrate is a specific discipline around compartmentalization, an ability to fully engage with desire in its designated time and place, while maintaining an almost inhuman level of focus during the actual execution of his campaigns. The lesson from Napoleon isn't indulgence without cost. It's that the variable that matters most isn't simply the presence or absence of desire, but whether a man has built the structural discipline to prevent it from bleeding into and degrading every other domain of his life. Three very different men: a Russian novelist tortured by decades of cyclical failure and eventual redirection, an Indian lawyer and political leader who made a deliberate formal vow and directly credited it with his capacity for sustained resistance, a French emperor who never suppressed the drive at all, but built an iron discipline around when and where it was permitted to operate. All three achieved extraordinary things, and none of them got there by pretending the drive didn't exist or didn't matter. Every one of them built a deliberate relationship to it, rather than simply being carried wherever it happened to pull them on any given day. That's the actual through line worth extracting from history here, and it matters more than which specific strategy any individual man ultimately chose. The men who built extraordinary things weren't the men with the weakest drive. In several of the most famous cases on record, they were men who described that drive, in their own words, as unusually intense. What distinguished them wasn't the absence of the force Schopenhauer described. It was the presence of a deliberate, examined relationship to it, built through genuine self-honesty rather than either denial or unexamined indulgence. Now, something about the modern female experience of this same mechanism, because the video that partly inspired this one made an observation worth taking further rather than leaving as a brief aside. Men's experience of this drive is disproportionately visual and disproportionately served by direct, explicit content, and the modern data on male pornography consumption reflects that clearly. Women's experience runs through a different but equally powerful channel, and the romance literature genre that's exploded in popularity over the past decade, now one of the best-selling categories in publishing, functions as a direct parallel mechanism. The content in the most commercially successful titles in that category is engineered, in exactly the same way pornography is engineered for men, to produce an escalating, hyper-stimulating fantasy that no real relationship with any real, imperfect human partner can consistently compete with. The consequence for women, while it manifests differently than psychogenic erectile dysfunction, follows the identical underlying logic Schopenhauer described: a synthetic version of desire, infinitely available and engineered for maximum stimulation, competing directly against and steadily degrading the appetite for the harder, slower, more demanding real version. This matters because the temptation, when people discuss this topic, is always to make it sound like a uniquely male failing. It isn't. Schopenhauer's will doesn't distinguish by gender in what it's attempting to accomplish through you. It simply routes through whatever channel each sex is, on average, more responsive to. Visual stimulation in one case, narrative and emotional stimulation in the other, and the synthetic industries that have emerged to exploit each channel have grown just as sophisticated and just as profitable, regardless of which sex they're targeting. The civilizational consequence, though, tends to land hardest and most visibly on men, for a reason worth stating plainly. A woman who consumes synthetic romantic content and then struggles to find a real relationship matching it is dealing with a personal disappointment. A man whose actual physiological capacity for real intimacy has been measurably degraded by years of escalating synthetic stimulation, to the point of documented rising rates of dysfunction with no physical cause, in the exact age bracket that should represent his peak biological capacity, is dealing with something considerably closer to a direct assault on the actual mechanism of reproduction itself. Both consequences matter, but only one of them shows up directly in national birth rate statistics as a hard biological ceiling rather than simply a preference or a disappointment. Now, I want to close on the question of meaning because I think this is where most discussions of this topic fail most completely, including, frankly, most religious and most secular treatments of it alike. The reason lust is so difficult to defeat through pure prohibition, through simply being told no over and over, is that prohibition alone doesn't offer anything to replace what's being removed. Schopenhauer's own life is instructive here, in a way that's often missed. He didn't simply refuse the will's demand and leave a void where it had been. He redirected an almost equivalent intensity into his philosophical work, producing one of the most complete and rigorous metaphysical systems in the history of Western thought, driven by what by all contemporary accounts was an obsessive, singular focus that mirrors, structurally, the exact intensity he identified as characteristic of unexamined desire itself. This is the actual mechanism worth understanding, stripped of all religious or moralistic framing. The energy Schopenhauer described as the will's tool for manipulating you into reproduction isn't, in itself, evil, dirty, or something to be simply eliminated. It's raw, undirected, extraordinarily powerful fuel. History's evidence, across every example this video has walked through, from Augustine to Tolstoy to Gandhi to Napoleon, to the darkest possible example in Vienna, suggests overwhelmingly that this fuel doesn't disappear when it's denied its default outlet. It converts, and it goes somewhere. The only genuine choice available to any man is whether that conversion happens deliberately, towards something he's consciously chosen and would be proud to have built, or by default, toward whatever the path of least resistance in his environment happens to offer. An infinite scroll, an engineered escalation of synthetic content, a slow and largely invisible erosion of his own actual capacity for the real thing he was, underneath all of it, actually looking for the entire time. The generation currently watching this video is living through the largest uncontrolled experiment in human history on exactly this question, at a scale and an intensity no previous generation, not Augustine's, not Schopenhauer's, not even the generation directly before this one, ever had to navigate. The synthetic version has never been more available, more engineered, or more immediately satisfying, and the data on what that availability is doing to actual human connection, actual relationship formation, and actual demographic survival is no longer ambiguous. It's measured, published, and getting worse year over year. The boulder is already at the top of the hill. It always has been, in every generation, in every man, since long before Augustine ever picked up a pen to describe his own version of it. What's changed isn't the boulder, it's the slope beneath it, engineered now deliberately by industries that profit specifically from how far and how fast it rolls once it starts.